I watched in horror as the tow truck driver secured chains around the aircraft that had sat in my backyard for decades. My hands were shaking as I dialed the phone number I had been trying to reach for weeks. "Please, you have to stop them," I pleaded into the voicemail. "This is not just some old plane. This is evidence in a federal investigation." The HOA Karen stood on my lawn with her arms crossed, smiling like she had just won the lottery. She had no idea what she was about to destroy. The plane that everyone called junk was actually the key to solving aviation mysteries that had haunted investigators for over 30 years. As the truck pulled away with my uncle's most precious possession, my phone finally rang. The voice on the other end made my blood run cold. "Sir, this is Agent Martinez with the NTSB. We have been looking for that aircraft for 20 years. The day I inherited my uncle's house, I thought I was getting a simple suburban property with a nice yard and maybe some family memories. I was not prepared for what I found in the backyard. There, sitting behind an overgrown hedge like some forgotten relic, was an old airplane. My Uncle Robert had never mentioned the aircraft in all our conversations. He was a quiet man who kept to himself after retirement. When he passed away suddenly from a heart attack, I became the sole heir to his modest home in Willow Creek Estates. The lawyers handed me the keys and wished me luck with the estate cleanup. Standing in that backyard on a gray October morning, I felt completely overwhelmed. The plane was not huge, but it was definitely not small either. It looked like something from the 1980s, with faded paint and windows that had seen better days. Rust covered parts of the fuselage, and weeds grew up around the landing gear. I had no idea what to do with it. How do you dispose of an airplane? Can you even have an airplane in a residential backyard? These questions swirled in my mind as I walked around the aircraft, taking photos with my phone. Within hours of my arrival, the neighbors started appearing. They would walk their dogs extra slowly past the fence, craning their necks to get a better look at me and the plane. Some were friendly enough, offering condolences about my uncle and asking if I needed help with anything. Others just stared and whispered among themselves. The first person to actually approach me directly was Mrs. Henderson from next door. She was a sweet elderly woman who had been friends with my uncle for years. "Your Uncle Robert loved that old plane," she told me, leaning against the fence that separated our properties. "He spent hours out there, just sitting in the cockpit or cleaning parts of it. When people complained, he would get this look in his eyes, like he was protecting something precious." Her words stuck with me as I began the overwhelming task of sorting through my uncle's belongings. The house was filled with boxes of papers, books, and personal items that needed to be organized. Most of it seemed normal for a retired man living alone. But then I started finding things that did not make sense. In his home office, tucked away in filing cabinets, I discovered folders full of official-looking documents, aviation charts, maintenance records, and correspondence with various government agencies. The letterheads included the Federal Aviation Administration and something called the National Transportation Safety Board. My stomach tightened as I read through some of these papers. They were not casual hobby materials. These were serious, official documents that suggested my uncle had been involved in aviation investigations. But he had never mentioned being a pilot or working in aviation during any of our family gatherings. As I stood in his office, holding a stack of papers I did not understand, I heard a sharp knock at the front door. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a real estate magazine. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Hello there," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I am Karen Mitchell, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and discuss a small matter regarding your property." Even before she said another word, I knew this conversation was not going to be pleasant. Her tone was sweet, but there was steel underneath it. She was the kind of person who used phrases like small matter when she really meant big problem. "I could not help but notice the aircraft in your backyard," she continued, still smiling that cold smile. "I am sure you understand that it is quite an eyesore for the neighborhood. Property values, you know. I trust you will be arranging for its removal soon." It was not a question. It was a statement disguised as polite conversation. I found myself nodding and mumbling something about looking into it, just to get her away from my door. After she left, I went back to the boxes of papers with a new sense of urgency. Whatever that plane was, whatever my uncle had been involved in, I needed to understand it before Karen and her HOA decided to make my life miserable. Little did I know, I was already too late. 3 days after my uncomfortable introduction to Karen Mitchell, she was back at my door. This time, she was not smiling. She carried a manila envelope and had the determined look of someone who meant business. "I tried to be neighborly," she said, thrusting the envelope into my hands. "But since you have not taken any action regarding the aircraft, the HOA board has voted to issue a formal violation notice." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and read the official letterhead. "Notice of violation" was printed in bold letters across the top. The document demanded the removal of all non-conforming structures from my property within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in daily fines of $500, with the possibility of legal action and forced removal at my expense. "$500 a day?" I asked, my voice cracking with disbelief. "The board takes property standards very seriously," Karen replied, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We simply cannot allow one homeowner to drag down values for everyone else. I am sure you understand." After she left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the violation notice. 30 days felt like both an eternity and no time at all. I had been making progress sorting through my uncle's papers, but I was nowhere near understanding why he had kept that plane or what it meant to him. That evening, I decided to dig deeper into his files. I found a box labeled Robert Personal that I had not opened yet. Inside were more aviation documents, but these were different. These were letters, some typed and some handwritten, that painted a picture of a man under pressure. One letter was from the HOA, dated just 6 months before my uncle's death. It was essentially the same violation notice I had received, demanding removal of the aircraft. But attached to it was my uncle's response, written in his careful handwriting. "The aircraft in question is not decorative or recreational," he had written. "It serves an important purpose that I am not at liberty to discuss in detail. I respectfully request that the HOA board reconsider this action and allow me to maintain the aircraft on my property." The HOA's response was swift and brutal. They rejected his request and doubled the fines. My uncle had been fighting the same battle I was now facing, and from the look of the correspondence, he had been losing. But there was something else in that box that made my heart race. Aviation accident reports, newspaper clippings about plane crashes, and correspondence with families of crash victims. These were not random hobby materials. My uncle had been involved in investigating aviation accidents, and somehow this plane in his backyard was connected to that work. I spent the next several days researching everything I could find about the aircraft. Using the tail number I had copied from the plane, I searched online databases and aviation forums. What I found made my hands shake with excitement and terror. The plane had been involved in a significant aviation incident in 1987, a mid-air collision that killed 12 people and remained partially unsolved due to missing evidence. According to the records I found, this aircraft had been one of the planes involved in the collision. It had made an emergency landing, but was supposed to have been preserved as evidence for the ongoing investigation. Somehow my uncle had ended up with it, and somehow the investigation was still ongoing. I tried to call the NTSB directly, but found myself trapped in a maze of phone trees and bureaucratic procedures. Every person I spoke with wanted to transfer me to someone else. No one seemed to understand the urgency of my situation or the significance of what I had discovered. Meanwhile, Karen was not waiting for me to figure things out. She organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss the aircraft problem. I was not officially invited, but Mrs. Henderson warned me about it. "She has been going door to door," Mrs. Henderson told me over the fence, "showing people pictures of your backyard and talking about how it is bringing down everyone's property values. Some folks are getting pretty worked up about it." The night of the meeting, I decided to attend uninvited. I walked into the community center to find about 30 of my neighbors sitting in folding chairs, listening to Karen give what sounded like a political speech. "We all moved to Willow Creek Estates because of the standards," she was saying. "We pay HOA fees to ensure that our community maintains its character and property values. We cannot allow one person to destroy what we have all worked to build." When I stood up to speak, the room went quiet. I tried to explain that the plane might have historical significance, that it could be important evidence in an ongoing investigation. But Karen cut me off. "That is exactly the kind of desperate excuse we expected," she said with a dismissive wave. "Mr. Thompson inherited a problem and now he wants to make it our problem. The solution is simple. Remove the eyesore and restore our community standards." The room erupted in applause. I looked around at faces that had been friendly just days before, now turned cold and hostile. I was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. As I walked home that night, I realized I was not just fighting for an old airplane. I was fighting for my uncle's legacy and for something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. I stopped sleeping. Every night, I sat at my uncle's desk surrounded by aviation manuals, accident reports, and NTSB documents, trying to piece together a puzzle that had been decades in the making. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the plane in my backyard was not just evidence. It was the key to solving a mystery that had haunted investigators for over 30 years. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. I had been searching through online databases when I found a reference to the 1987 mid-air collision that mentioned my uncle by name. Robert Thompson, NTSB investigator, had been the lead on the case. My quiet, retired uncle had been a federal aviation safety investigator. Suddenly, everything made sense. His secretiveness about his work, his fierce protection of the aircraft, his willingness to fight the HOA despite the mounting fines. He had not been hoarding junk. He had been preserving evidence. I printed every document I could find and spread them across his dining room table. The collision had involved 2 aircraft over rural Pennsylvania. A small private plane had collided with a commercial flight during approach to a regional airport. All 12 people aboard both aircraft had died instantly. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that crucial evidence from both planes had been damaged or destroyed in the crash. But somehow, My uncle had managed to salvage the private aircraft and transport it to his property for detailed analysis. According to the files, the investigation had been suspended but never officially closed due to unanswered questions about the cause of the collision. My hands were shaking as I called the NTSB again. This time, I had names and case numbers. I was not just some confused homeowner with an old plane. I was the nephew of Robert Thompson, and I had evidence they needed. But the bureaucracy was still slow and frustrating. The person who answered the phone promised to look into it and get back to me. Days passed with no response. I left voicemails that were never returned. I sent emails that disappeared into the void of government inefficiency. Meanwhile, my 30-day deadline was approaching fast. Karen seemed to take pleasure in reminding me of the approaching deadline. She would walk past my house every morning during her power walk, always slowing down to stare at the plane and shake her head with disapproval. One morning, she stopped at my mailbox where I was collecting my mail. 15 days left, she said cheerfully. I do hope you have made arrangements for removal. The board has already approved the towing company we will use if you fail to comply. I am waiting to hear back from the NTSB, I told her. This plane is evidence in a federal investigation. Karen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, please. That is the most ridiculous story I have ever heard. Next you will be telling me it belonged to aliens or something. The plane is junk and you are just trying to avoid taking responsibility. She walked away before I could respond, but her dismissive attitude only made me more determined. I was not making this up. I had the documents to prove it. The problem was getting someone in authority to listen to me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door one evening with a plate of cookies and a worried expression. I have been thinking about what you said about the plane being evidence, she said as we sat in my living room. Your uncle and I used to talk sometimes, especially after his wife died. He never told me exactly what he did for work, but he mentioned once that he investigated airplane crashes. She paused, choosing her words carefully. There was something else. About 6 months before he died, a man came to see him, official-looking fellow in a government car. They spent hours out in the backyard looking at the plane. Your uncle was very excited after the visit, like maybe his work was finally getting somewhere. My heart pounded as she continued. The next week, Robert told me he had contacted some families of people who died in a crash a long time ago. He said he might finally be able to give them answers. After Mrs. Henderson left, I went back to the files with new purpose. If my uncle had been in contact with victim families, there might be records of those conversations. And if the NTSB was interested enough to send someone to look at the plane, maybe the investigation was more active than I had realized. I found what I was looking for in a folder marked Family Correspondence. Letters from relatives of crash victims, thanking my uncle for his continued work on their cases. Phone numbers and addresses of people who had been waiting decades for answers about how their loved ones died. Reading those letters broke my heart and strengthened my resolve at the same time. These were not just files and case numbers. These were real people who deserved to know the truth. And if Karen Mitchell had her way, that truth would be hauled away to a scrap yard and destroyed forever. I had 9 days left to save 30 years of investigative work. 9 days to honor my uncle's memory and preserve evidence that could finally bring closure to grieving families. The clock was ticking, and I was running out of options. Karen Mitchell was not content to wait for the 30-day deadline. She launched what I can only describe as a neighborhood warfare campaign, designed to turn every resident of Willow Creek Estates against me and my junk plane. It started with a petition. She went door to door with a clipboard and a folder full of photos she had taken of my backyard from various angles. The photos made the plane look worse than it actually was, shot from low angles that emphasized the rust and weeds while hiding the parts that were actually well maintained. Property values in our community have dropped 3% since that eyesore appeared, she told everyone who would listen. I have no idea where she got that statistic, but she repeated it so often that people began treating it as fact. Within a week, she had collected signatures from over 60 households demanding immediate removal of the aircraft. She presented the petition to me personally, arriving at my door with two other HOA board members as witnesses. "The community has spoken," she announced, holding up the petition like a weapon. "Your neighbors have made it clear that they will not tolerate this any longer." But Karen was not done. She contacted the local newspaper, presenting herself as a concerned homeowner fighting to preserve community standards. The article that appeared made me sound like a hoarder who was destroying the neighborhood out of stubbornness and disrespect for my neighbors. Then she escalated to television. A local news station ran a story about HOA disputes that featured my house prominently. Karen was interviewed in front of my property, gesticulating toward the plane while talking about property rights and community responsibility. "We have tried to work with Mr. Thompson," she said to the camera, "but he refuses to be reasonable. Sometimes you have to take a stand for what is right." The news story brought protesters. People I had never seen before showed up in my neighborhood carrying signs that read, "Respect your neighbors," and "Remove the eyesore." They marched up and down my street for hours, chanting slogans and taking selfies with the plane in the background. I felt like I was under siege in my own home. Every time I looked out the window, there were people staring at my property and pointing. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting quotes and neighbors wanting to complain. But the worst revelation came when I started investigating Karen herself. I had been so focused on saving the plane that I had not thought to look into who was really behind this campaign against me. A property records search revealed that Karen owned not just her own home, but several undeveloped lots in the area surrounding Willow Creek Estates. She also sat on the board of a local development company that had been quietly buying up land for a major expansion project. My uncle's property, with its large backyard and prime location, would be worth a fortune to developers, but only if it could be cleared of any obstacles that might complicate construction or zoning approvals. I dug deeper and found connections that made my stomach turn. Karen's husband worked for the city planning department. Her brother owned one of the largest towing companies in the county. Her development company had received several major contracts from the city over the past few years. This was not about community standards or property values. This was about money and power and clearing obstacles for profitable development projects. Armed with this information, I tried to present my case to the HOA board. I requested a formal hearing where I could present evidence about the plane's significance and expose Karen's conflicts of interest. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community center. I spent days preparing, organizing documents, and practicing what I would say. I was ready to fight for my uncle's legacy and expose the corruption that was driving this whole conflict. But when I arrived at the community center, I realized I had been set up. Karen had packed the room with supporters, many of whom I recognized from the protest outside my house. The board members looked uncomfortable, like they already knew how this was going to end. I presented my evidence about the plane's connection to the NTSB investigation. I showed them documents proving my uncle had been a federal investigator. I explained that destroying the aircraft could interfere with an ongoing federal case. Karen dismissed everything I said as conspiracy theories and desperate lies. She accused me of making up stories to avoid taking responsibility for my property. The crowd murmured agreement with everything she said. Then she played her trump card. She announced that the board had already voted to authorize immediate removal of the aircraft, effective in 48 hours. A towing company had been contracted, and city officials had been notified to ensure there would be no interference. "We have been more than patient," she said, looking directly at me. "But patience has its limits. This community will not be held hostage by one person's selfishness." The room erupted in applause. I sat there feeling completely defeated, watching neighbors I had never met cheer for the destruction of evidence that could solve a 30-year-old mystery and bring closure to grieving families. As I walked to my car after the meeting, Corinne followed me out. "You could have made this easy," she said quietly. "Now it is going to be very difficult." I realized then that I was not just fighting an HOA dispute. I was fighting a system designed to crush anyone who stood in the way of money and influence. Corinne Mitchell was not just a neighborhood busybody. She was a predator who used community power to further her own financial interests. And in 48 hours, she was going to destroy the only evidence that could expose her corruption and solve my uncle's final case. 48 hours. That was all I had left before Corinne's towing company would arrive to destroy 30 years of investigative work. I had not slept in 3 days, and my phone had become permanently attached to my ear as I made increasingly desperate calls to anyone who might be able to help. The NTSB was still buried in bureaucracy. Every person I spoke with promised to look into my case and get back to me, but no one seemed to understand the urgency. Federal agencies do not move quickly, even when someone is screaming that crucial evidence is about to be destroyed. I tried contacting the families mentioned in my uncle's correspondence. Most of the phone numbers were disconnected after so many years, but I managed to reach 3 family members of crash victims. They were shocked to learn that the investigation was still ongoing and horrified that evidence might be destroyed. "My daughter died in that crash," one father told me, his voice breaking with emotion. "If there is any chance that plane could help us understand what happened, you cannot let them destroy it." But sympathy and moral support were not enough to stop Corinne's machine. I needed legal intervention, and I needed it fast. I called every lawyer I could find, explaining my situation and begging for emergency assistance. Most of them listened politely, and then explained that stopping an HOA enforcement action would require extensive litigation that could take months or years. One lawyer was more direct. "Son, you are fighting City Hall, the HOA, and private business interests all at the same time. Even if you are right about everything, you do not have enough time or money to win this fight." Wednesday night, less than 24 hours before the scheduled removal, I made a decision that felt like surrender and victory at the same time. If I could not save the plane, I could at least document everything about it before it was destroyed. I spent the entire night in my backyard with cameras, flashlights, and measuring tools. I photographed every inch of the aircraft from every possible angle. I documented serial numbers, maintenance markings, and anything else that might be useful to investigators later. Inside the cockpit, I found something that made my heart race. Hidden behind a panel, probably placed there by my uncle, was a small metal container. Inside were photographs, documents, and what looked like pieces of aircraft wreckage from the original crash. My uncle had not just preserved the plane. He had used it as a hiding place for evidence that someone had tried to destroy or cover up. Evidence that could prove what really caused the collision that killed 12 people. As the sun rose on Thursday morning, I heard the rumble of heavy machinery approaching my street. Karen's towing company had arrived right on schedule, with two massive trucks and enough equipment to remove an aircraft twice the size of my uncle's plane. I stood in my driveway watching the trucks position themselves around the plane. The crew was professional and efficient, clearly experienced in removing large objects from residential properties. They had done this before. Karen arrived in her luxury SUV, dressed like she was attending a celebration. She stood at the edge of my property with her arms crossed, supervising the operation like a general commanding troops. "I tried to make this easy for you," she called out to me. "You chose to do this the hard way." I tried one last desperate tactic. I called 911 and reported that federal evidence was being destroyed. The dispatcher listened patiently, but explained that unless I had a court order or federal agents willing to intervene, there was nothing local police could do about a lawful HOA enforcement action. As the towing crew attached chains and cables to the aircraft, I continued making phone calls. NTSB investigators, FBI field offices, congressional representatives, anyone who might have the authority to stop what was happening. Most of the calls went to voicemail. The few people who answered listened to my frantic explanations and promised to look into it, but no one offered immediate help. I watched in helpless rage as the plane was lifted from its resting place and secured to the transport truck. 30 years of investigative work, evidence that could solve cold cases and bring closure to families, was being treated like scrap metal. The crew worked quickly and professionally. Within 2 hours, the aircraft was loaded and ready for transport. Karen signed paperwork with the crew chief and handed him what looked like a substantial cash payment. As the trucks prepared to leave, I made one final, desperate phone call to the NTSB emergency line. I was transferred 3 times before reaching someone who claimed to have authority to help. "Please," I begged into the phone, "you have to stop them. This plane is evidence in the Thompson investigation. Robert Thompson was your investigator. This is his case." The voice on the other end went quiet for a long moment. "Did you say Robert Thompson?" the voice asked. "Yes," I replied, watching the truck start their engines. "He was my uncle. The plane is leaving right now." "Sir, do not let that aircraft leave your sight," the voice said urgently. "We have been looking for that plane for 20 years. The voice on the phone belonged to Agent Martinez, a senior NTSB investigator who had worked with my uncle for over 15 years. When I mentioned Robert Thompson's name, everything changed. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to follow that truck," Agent Martinez said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Do not let it out of your sight. I am dispatching federal agents to intercept, but I need you to track the location until they arrive." My hands were shaking as I jumped into my car and pulled out behind the convoy. The 2 towing trucks moved slowly through my neighborhood, completely unaware that they were transporting evidence that the federal government had been searching for since my uncle's death. Karen followed in her SUV, probably planning to supervise the destruction of the aircraft at whatever scrap yard or disposal facility she had arranged. She had no idea that her moment of triumph was about to become her worst nightmare. I stayed on the phone with Agent Martinez as I followed the trucks toward the industrial part of town. He explained that my uncle had been working on several cold cases when he died, including the 1987 collision. The NTSB had lost track of the aircraft after Robert's death and assumed it had been destroyed or lost. "Your uncle was brilliant but secretive," Martinez told me. "He never fully trusted the bureaucracy to protect important evidence. Looks like he was right to be paranoid." 20 minutes into the drive, I saw them. 3 black SUVs with government plates, approaching fast from the opposite direction. They formed a roadblock that forced the towing trucks to stop in the parking lot of an abandoned shopping center. I pulled into the lot and watched as federal agents emerged from the vehicles, displaying badges and official paperwork. The scene transformed instantly from a routine towing job to a federal investigation. Karen jumped out of her SUV, her face red with rage and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" she shouted at the lead agent. "This is a lawful HOA enforcement action. You have no authority here." Agent Martinez, a tall man with graying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had dealt with difficult people for decades, handed her a document. "Ma'am, this aircraft is evidence in an ongoing federal investigation," he said politely but firmly. "This stop order supersedes any local or HOA authority. The plane is now in federal custody." Karen's expression shifted from rage to something approaching panic as she read the document. For the first time since I had met her, she looked uncertain and afraid. "This is ridiculous," she stammered. "It is just an old plane. This man is making up stories to avoid following community rules." Agent Martinez turned to me with a slight smile. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for preserving your uncle's work. Robert always said that evidence has a way of surviving if you protect it long enough." The federal agents treated the aircraft like a crime scene. They documented its condition, photographed every detail, and carefully secured it for transport to an NTSB facility. Other agents interviewed the towing crew, Karen and me, taking detailed statements about how the removal had been organized and authorized. As the investigation unfolded, Karen's connections and financial interests became part of the federal record. Her development company, her husband's position with the city, her brother's towing business. What had started as an HOA dispute was now a potential federal case involving corruption and obstruction of justice. Local media arrived as word spread about the federal intervention. The same reporters who had covered Karen's campaign against me now wanted to know why the government was seizing an aircraft from a residential towing job. Agent Martinez held an impromptu press conference in the parking lot, explaining that the aircraft contained